evening. A huge military convoy of tanks and armoured vehicles rolled into Tiananmen Square in the heart of Beijing this afternoon as the bloody military crackdown on pro-democracy protesters continued. Stuart Pallister reports.
Helicopters buzzed overhead around the city centre, with one landing in the middle of Tiananmen Square surrounded by troops. The Avenue of Eternal Peace has failed to live up to its name. Eyewitnesses in the Beijing hotel reported seeing at least 2 people fall under a hail of bullets fired at random as troops drove to Tiananmen Square. In the square, there were reportedly more than 65 tanks and armoured personnel carriers sitting directly below the portrait of Mao Zedong. But resistance to the crackdown continues. Hundreds of unarmed cyclists have confronted troops lined up across one of the entrances to the square, shouting "Animals, animals," every time the soldiers fired a volley. One man even tried to halt a line of tanks single-handedly. He blocked a line of 10 tanks and 10 troop carriers moving west from Tiananmen early this afternoon and climbed on top of the lead vehicle. Troops began firing automatic weapons and a helicopter appeared overhead. Hundreds of people fled in panic, leaving the man to face the tanks alone. Finally, about half a dozen people rushed over and dragged the man to safety. Soldiers fired wildly as they passed through a foreign embassy area of Beijing. They charged into a residential area near Tiananmen Square at about noon, firing down narrow streets. Shooting has also been reported in the northwest of the city near the campus area. There's been no official confirmation about the number of casualties, but the Reuters news agency says there's an estimate, apparently based on official information, that up to 7,000 people may have died. Beijing television has denied what it called a rumour that 3,000 died in the attack on the square.
The army occupation of central Beijing began on Saturday night as troops moved in to evacuate students who have been demonstrating in Tiananmen Square for 3 weeks. We have this report on the first few hours of the military move.
It was the swift and terrible ending to the Beijing Spring of 1989. Hundreds of thousands of students and workers and other hopeful Chinese citizens who, through their long demonstration for democracy, had been seeking a peaceful dialogue with the leaders of this vast nation, received instead the harshest of responses to their demands for reform and freedom. An estimated 30,000 Chinese army troops were sent into the capital to crush what the government called a small band of hooligans and gangsters. Counter-revolutionaries, the government called them, who were attempting to overthrow the communist regime that has ruled this country for the past 40 years. It is difficult not to use the word massacre to describe what happened. The military, moving in armored vehicles, smashed through barricades that had been put up by the protesters and advanced relentlessly toward Tiananmen Square, where for the past several weeks, students had been staging a sit-in demanding the resignation of hardline Premier Li Peng and an end to widespread corruption inside the Chinese government. They fired automatic weapons into crowds of citizens who, for the most part, could fight back with nothing more than rocks and bottles. They fired their weapons even as the mobs were chanting slogans like, "You are the People's Liberation Army and we are the people." They fired their weapons into groups of demonstrators that sometimes numbered in the tens of thousands. Finally, the troops reached their objective, and in a last-ditch effort, demonstrators tossed firebombs onto the tanks and armored personnel carriers as they rolled into Tiananmen Square. But it didn't take long before the Chinese army had forced thousands of demonstrators to leave their encampment and fall back toward the Beijing Hotel a short distance away. Not all of them were able to escape, Bodies of demonstrators were scattered throughout the 100-acre square, and wounded were carried away to get them out of the line of fire. The military force now holding Tiananmen Square numbers several thousand, including dozens of tanks and other vehicles which have been lined up across Chang'an Boulevard. Even late this morning, the defiant survivors were still attempting to counterattack, commandeering an ambulance, setting it on fire, and aiming it directly at soldiers who had taken up defensive positions down the street. Once again, the army opened fire on the demonstrators, and before it was over, at least 3 more civilians had been killed. Government TV later showed soldiers toppling the Goddess of Democracy statue put up by the students less than a week ago. It was declared a great victory against the counter-revolutionaries, but the announcers reading the news were both wearing black.
Share prices on the local stock market plunged sharply today in reaction to the violence in Beijing. The Hang Seng Index lost 22%, or 581 points, to close at 2,093.
Reaction to the uncertainty in China, with property shares leading the fall. Several brokers say they think local and international investors will stay away until the situation becomes
people. I think they are not a human being, just like an animal, you know.
It was much the same on the West Coast, where Chinese students protested in Los Angeles, and in the South, where they paraded in Houston. U.S. foreign policy experts were similarly angered by events in Beijing. On ABC's This Week with David Brinkley, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger said there was a tragic irony in the bloody crackdown ordered by Chinese leaders.
They have killed the forces, or individuals representing the forces, that they themselves encouraged over the last 10 years, and that must have an impact.
China's official media have imposed a near-total blackout on the bloody events in Tiananmen. Hong Kong newspapers today urge their readers to fax reports on the army action to their friends and relatives in China. The suppression of reports on the clashes in Beijing is expected to prompt many Chinese to tune into foreign radio broadcasts.
Despite the Chinese government's attempt to cut off news coverage, people in this country are seeing broadcasts of the events in China only hours after they occur. But for the Chinese, the picture is far less complete and more serene. This Chinese broadcast reported the deaths of some soldiers, but made no mention of civilian casualties and presented an image of the army as cleanup crew. Even so, millions of Chinese are able to get the straight story.
At least 1,400 Chinese are now believed dead in a bloody assault by Chinese troops early Sunday.
The news comes from here, Washington, D.C., where the government-funded Voice of America beams out the story from Beijing to all of China.
We are the most pervasive source of news for hundreds of millions of Chinese.
On average days, the Voice of America claims 60 million Chinese listeners. Now the number is likely to be far higher, and the VOA's increased its Chinese language reports to 10 hours daily.
领导阶层中的死硬派